My boss laughed out loud when I handed him my resignation letter. He said he wasn't worried at all. 3 weeks later, he understood why he should have been. He laughed. Actually laughed. Leaned back in that leather chair, shook his head, and let it go on long enough to make sure I heard every second of it. My resignation letter was still on his desk. 14 of his biggest clients had my personal number saved in their phones. He didn't know that yet. He called me a strong producer, told me I'd land somewhere small, and picked up his phone like the meeting was already over. I walked out of that office without a word. 72 hours later, his quarterly report would never look the same again, and neither would mine. The alarm went off at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before it was supposed to. Carter Blake lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of his Lincoln Park apartment, listening to the low hum of the city beginning its day. Outside, Chicago was already moving, delivery trucks grinding down Fullerton Avenue, the distant clatter of the Red Line making its first run northbound, the wind off Lake Michigan pressing against the windows like it always did in November. Cold, grey, indifferent. He had lived in this city for 9 years and had come to believe it matched his mood more often than not. He reached over and silenced the alarm before it could finish its first cycle. That small act of control, stopping something before it became an intrusion, felt important this morning in a way he couldn't quite name. Carter sat up and rubbed his face with both hands. 34 years old, a decade in sales, the last 6 of them at Hargrove and Lind, one of Chicago's mid-sized but aggressively ambitious marketing consultancy firms. He had come in as a junior account executive with 2 clients and a business card that still had a typo on it. He was leaving, today, if everything went the way he had planned, as the firm's top-producing account manager, responsible for a portfolio worth just over $4 million in annual recurring revenue. He was leaving. That was the part his brain kept circling back to, the way a tongue finds a sore tooth. He made coffee in the dark kitchen, standing at the counter in his undershirt and sweatpants, watching the machine drip and thinking about the last 18 months. That was when things had shifted at Hargrove and Lind, not dramatically, not with a single explosive moment, but the way a foundation cracks, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one morning you look down and realize the floor is no longer level. Derek Holloway had been promoted to Senior Managing Director 18 months ago. Before Derek, Carter had reported to Patricia Huang, a sharp and demanding woman who had nonetheless operated on a principle Carter respected. Results spoke louder than politics. Under Patricia, Carter had built his portfolio from 2 clients to 19. He had landed Whitfield Logistics, a mid-sized freight company run by James Whitfield, a blunt and practical man who had become not just Carter's biggest client, but something close to a professional mentor. He had developed the Mercer account, the Donnelly Group, TerraCore Solutions. He had put in 7 days a week for 3 years straight, eaten lunch at his desk more times than he could count, and had turned down 2 outside offers because Patricia had told him directly, "Stay and you'll make partner before you're 36. Patricia had left for a competitor in April of last year. 2 weeks later, Derek Holloway arrived. Carter poured his coffee and leaned against the counter. Derek was the kind of man who filled a room not with charisma, but with noise. He was 52, broad-shouldered, always in a suit that was slightly too expensive for the context. With silver hair he kept impeccably groomed, and a laugh that came too easily and too loudly. He had spent 15 years at a larger firm in New York before a restructuring, the specifics of which he never discussed, had brought him to Chicago. He spoke in sports metaphors and called people chief and sport. He had a habit of repeating other people's ideas back to them in meetings as if he had just invented them. In their first one-on-one, Derek had looked at Carter's portfolio numbers with what seemed like genuine interest. Then he had leaned back in his chair and said, "You're a strong producer, Blake. I just want to make sure we're maximizing the upside here. There's a bigger game being played, and I'm not sure you're seeing the full board." Carter had nodded and said nothing, because he had not yet understood that Derek's version of the bigger game had very little to do with client results and almost everything to do with internal positioning. The next 18 months were an education. Derek restructured the commission model twice in ways that consistently diluted the earnings of high-producing individual contributors while rewarding team leads who reported directly to him. He introduced a new client assignment protocol that required all incoming leads to go through his office first, giving him effective control over who got access to the best opportunities. He took credit in presentations for strategies that Carter and Nathan Price, his closest colleague, had developed together over weekends and late nights. And when Carter raised concerns, measured, documented professional, Derek listened with the expression of a man who found the whole thing mildly amusing and then did nothing. By October, Carter had done the math. He had also done something else. He had spent 4 months quietly having honest conversations with his clients, not soliciting them, not making promises, just being transparent, the way he had always been, about the direction of the firm, about his own situation, about what he valued in a professional relationship. He let them draw their own conclusions. He also had a lawyer review his contract. His non-compete clause was narrow and, according to the attorney, unlikely to be enforceable given the specific circumstances. His non-solicitation clause had a 12-month window and applied only to clients he had inherited, not the ones he had originated himself. He had originated 14 of his 19 clients himself. He finished his coffee, set the mug in the sink, and walked to the bedroom to put on the suit he had laid out the night before. Navy blue, white shirt, no tie. He wanted to look like himself, not like someone performing an exit. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from James Whitfield. "Good luck today. You know where to find us." Carter looked at the message for a long moment. Then he put the phone in his pocket and picked up his keys. Outside, the November wind hit him like a verdict. He walked to his car without hurrying. He had a 9 a.m. meeting with Derek Holloway, one he had requested himself 3 days ago, with no explanation given. He had a resignation letter in the inside pocket of his jacket. He had a new LLC registered in Delaware, a signed office lease in River North, and a business partner named Brooke Callahan, who was at this exact moment sitting in their new office drinking her own coffee and waiting for the day to begin. He had everything he needed. He pulled out of the parking garage and headed south on Clark Street, the skyline emerging grey and massive through the windshield, and thought, not for the first time, that the only thing he had miscalculated was how long he had waited to do this. The elevator at Hargrove and Lind opened onto the 14th floor at 8:51 a.m. Carter stepped out into the familiar corridor. The same charcoal carpet, the same framed campaign work on the walls, the same faint smell of printer toner and coffee that had been part of his mornings for 6 years. The receptionist, a young woman named Alicia, looked up and smiled the way she always did, and Carter smiled back with the same ease he always had, because whatever this day was going to become, it had nothing to do with Alicia. He set his bag at his desk, opened his laptop out of habit, and then closed it. He would not be needing it in the way he usually did. He had already spent the previous evening transferring personal files to an external drive. Nothing proprietary, nothing that belonged to the firm, just his own notes, his own frameworks, the accumulated intellectual material of a decade in the field that was unambiguously his. Nathan Price appeared at the edge of his cubicle at 8:58, holding a coffee cup and wearing the expression of someone who knew something was about to happen without knowing exactly what. "You good?" Nathan said. "Yeah," Carter said. "I'm good." Nathan looked at him for a moment longer than the question required. Then he nodded once and walked back to his desk. At 9:02, Carter knocked on the glass door of Derek Holloway's corner office. "Blake!" Derek called out, with the particular brand of enthusiasm that Carter had long since identified as performance. "Come in! Come in! Shut the door!" The office smelled like Derek's cologne and the leather of his chair. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the loop and the grey stretch of the Chicago River below. Derek was already standing behind his desk in a charcoal suit, hands in his pockets, projecting the relaxed authority of a man who had never once doubted that any room he occupied was his. Carter sat down across from him without being invited to. He placed the envelope on the desk. Derek looked at it, then at Carter. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not concern exactly, more like recalibration. "What's this?" Derek said. "My resignation," Carter said. 2 weeks' notice, as required by my contract. My last day will be November 22nd. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds, long enough to be deliberate. And then Derek Holloway laughed. It wasn't a short laugh or a polite laugh, or even a dismissive laugh. It was a full, genuine, unhurried laugh. The kind that comes from a place of real amusement, from someone who has just heard something they find fundamentally absurd. He leaned back slightly, shook his head, and let it go on for just long enough to make the point he wanted to make. "Blake," he said, when the laugh had run its course. "Come on, seriously?" Carter said nothing. "You're walking away from this?" Derek gestured broadly, as if the office itself were the offer. "You've got a good thing here. Solid book of business, a team behind you, room to grow. You really want to start over somewhere else because of a couple of comp adjustments that didn't go your way." "This isn't a negotiation," Carter said. Derek picked up the envelope, turned it over once, and set it back down with the casual indifference of a man handling junk mail. "I'm not worried," he said. "Honestly, Carter. And I mean this, I'm not worried at all. Your clients are clients of this firm. They'll stay with the firm. That's how this works." He smiled the way he always smiled when he wanted you to know he had already won something. "You'll land somewhere, maybe a smaller shop, maybe you try something on your own for a while, but you'll be back in a system like this one eventually, because that's where the real accounts live. And by the time you figure that out, your relationships here will have moved on." He leaned forward and picked up his phone, a gesture that signaled the meeting was over. "Good luck," Derek said. And then, almost to himself, with the faint residue of the earlier laugh still in his voice, "I really am not worried." Carter stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the office without another word. In the hallway, he allowed himself one breath, slow, deliberate, and then he kept moving. Nathan appeared beside him near the elevator bank. "How'd it go?" "He laughed," Carter said. Nathan stared at him. He laughed. "Yeah." "Okay," Nathan said quietly. "Then, for what it's worth, I put my own letter on Susan's desk this morning." Carter looked at him. "I've been watching you build that client list for 4 years, Nathan said. "I know what those relationships are actually worth, and I know who built them." He paused. "Wherever you're landing, if you need a head of business development, I'd like to have that conversation." Carter pressed the elevator button. "I'll call you tonight," he said. The doors opened. Carter stepped in, and the 14th floor, the charcoal carpet, the framed campaigns, the cologne-scented corner office, the echo of Derek Holloway's laugh, disappeared behind a set of closing doors. He rode down 14 floors in silence. By the time he walked out onto Wacker Drive, the wind off the river catching him full in the face, his phone had already received the first of what would become, over the next 72 hours, 14 separate emails from 14 separate clients. Each one a variation of the same message. "We heard you're leaving. We'd like to talk." He had not called a single one of them. He had not needed to. He put his collar up against the wind and started walking north. The office on Erie Street in River North was not impressive by any conventional measure. It was a single floor of a converted brick building, exposed beams, large industrial windows that let in generous light on clear days and a particular kind of honest grey on cloudy ones. There were 8 desks, a glass-walled conference room that fit 10 people if they didn't mind being close, a small kitchen, and a reception area that currently contained 2 chairs, a plant Brooke Callahan had brought from her apartment, and a whiteboard covered in writing that had not yet been erased from the planning sessions of the previous 2 weeks. Brooke was 31, compact and precise in the way that certain people are, the kind of precise that comes not from rigidity, but from a deep intolerance for wasted effort. She had worked at a competitor firm for 5 years before Carter had approached her 6 weeks ago, sitting across from her at a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue and laying out with complete transparency what he was building and what he was asking. She had listened without interrupting, asked 4 very specific questions, and then said, "When do we start?" She was already on a call when Carter arrived at the Erie Street office that first afternoon, his first afternoon as something other than an employee of someone else's vision. He set his jacket on the back of a chair, rolled up his sleeves, and looked at the whiteboard. The next 72 hours were not triumphant. They were not the montage of a man arriving in victory. They were, instead, the particular kind of exhausting that only people who have ever built something from nothing in a very short time will recognize. A blur of logistics, decisions, and the constant low-level anxiety of knowing that momentum is a fragile thing and that the window for capturing it is always narrower than it looks. 14 clients had reached out. 14 was not a guarantee, it was an opening. Carter and Brooke worked through the list methodically. Every client was different. James Whitfield of Whitfield Logistics was the most straightforward. He called Carter directly on the second day, said, "I'm not interested in working with whoever Derek Holloway installs in your place," and asked what the transition would look like. Carter walked him through it honestly, including the timelines, the staffing situation, and the fact that the new firm was not yet fully operational. "I've built companies from nothing," James said. "I know what the early days look like. I'm in." Others required more care. The Donnelly Group's contact, a CFO named Richard Oakes, was cautious by nature and needed 3 separate conversations before he was comfortable enough to sign a new service agreement. TerraCore's marketing director, a woman named Patricia Lynn, no relation to Carter's former boss, had a board to answer to and needed a formal presentation before she could recommend the switch. Carter gave every one of them what they needed. No pressure, no sales language, just honesty and time. There were also the 2 clients who didn't come. Of his 14 originated accounts, 2 ultimately stayed with Hargrove and Lind. One because the decision was made above the marketing director's pay grade by a CFO who preferred continuity, and one because the relationship had simply never been as strong as Carter had believed. He processed both losses without bitterness. They were information, not indictments. By the end of the first week, 12 clients had signed letters of intent. The aggregate annual contract value was $2. $3 million. Nathan Price joined the firm on a Friday morning, carrying a box of his own materials and a roster of industry contacts he had been quietly building for years. Brooke put him immediately to work on the business development pipeline. By noon, he was already on calls. But the building of the firm was not without its difficulties, and the week that followed the initial surge was the hardest. Hargrove and Lynn's legal team sent a letter, formal, aggressive in tone, citing the non-solicitation clause and requesting documentation of all communications Carter had conducted with firm clients in the 60 days prior to his resignation. Carter forwarded it immediately to his attorney, a deliberate woman named Carol Staines, who had been expecting something like this. "This is posturing," Carol told him after reading it. "Your non-solicit applies to inherited clients, of which you're keeping 0. Your originated clients made contact with you after your departure, which is legally and factually different from solicitation. They're trying to rattle you. Are they going to pursue it? Carter asked. They might file something to slow you down, Carol said, but they know the facts are against them. Derek Holloway is a smart enough operator to know when a legal fight is unwinnable. My read is this goes quiet within 30 days. Carter absorbed this. Okay, he said. What do I need to do? Keep records of everything, Carol said, and keep building. The best response to a threatening letter is a thriving business. He went back to the office on Erie Street and kept building. There were nights that week when he sat alone at his desk after Brooke and Nathan had gone home, looking at the spreadsheets and the contract drafts and the half-finished operational documents, and felt the specific weight of what he had done. Not regret exactly, but the sober awareness of how much was riding on the next 90 days and how thin the margin for error was. He had savings, he had clients, he had two good people. But the space between a promising start and a sustainable business was a long and uncertain road, and he was under no illusions about that. On one of those nights, James Whitfield called him at 9 p.m. "You still at the office?" James said. "Yeah," Carter said. "Go home," James said. "Not a suggestion. The decisions you make after 9 o'clock at night are never your best ones. I learned that the hard way." A pause. "You're going to be fine, Carter. I've watched you work for 4 years. You know what you're doing." Carter leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of the converted brick building, at the exposed beams and the industrial lights, at the small and improbable world he was trying to will into existence. "Thanks, James," he said. "Buy me lunch when you clear $1 million in quarterly revenue," James said, and hung up. Carter smiled at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he shut off the lights, locked the door behind him, and walked out into the cold Chicago night. 6 weeks after Carter Blake walked out of Hargrove and Lind, Derek Holloway called a mandatory all-hands meeting on the 14th floor. Carter was not there for it, of course. He heard about it afterward, first from Nathan, who still had contacts at the firm, and then from Susan Merritt, the head of HR, who reached out to Carter directly 3 weeks later for reasons of her own. By all accounts, the meeting was not what Derek had intended it to be. The math had become impossible to ignore. The departure of 14 clients, 12 of whom had converted to signed contracts with Carter's new firm, Blake and Callahan Partners, within 30 days, represented a revenue loss of $3 million in annual contracts from Hargrove and Lind's books. For a firm of Hargrove and Lind's size, that was not a catastrophic number, but it was a significant and very visible one. The kind that appears on quarterly reports in red. The kind that generates questions from partners and investors who do not generally accept personnel transition as a complete explanation. Derek, according to Nathan's account, had stood at the front of the room and delivered a presentation about recalibration and strategic realignment. The kind of language that experienced professionals immediately recognize as a cover for bad news. He had talked about new client acquisition initiatives and revised revenue targets and the importance of team cohesion. He had not mentioned Carter Blake by name. He had not needed to. Everyone in that room knew exactly what had happened and why. What Derek had not anticipated, or had anticipated and misjudged, was the effect of Carter's departure on the remaining staff. 3 other account managers had submitted resignations in the 6 weeks since Carter left. 2 of them cited the commission restructuring directly in their exit interviews that Susan Merritt was now conducting with what Carter could only imagine was a grim sense of documentation. The institutional knowledge walking out the door was not as dramatic as Carter's exit, but it was steady and it was cumulative. The legal letter, as Carol Staines had predicted, went quiet. 28 days after it was sent, with no response other than a brief and precise reply from Carroll's office establishing the legal basis for Carter's position, Hargrove and Lynn's attorneys sent a follow-up communication that was, in all but explicit language, a withdrawal. Derek had apparently been counseled that the case was not winnable and that pursuing it would cost more in legal fees and reputational exposure than the firm stood to recover. Carter read Carroll's summary of the withdrawal letter at his desk on Erie Street on a Tuesday morning. He read it twice. Then he set it aside and went back to the proposal he was working on for TerraCore's Q1 campaign. He did not feel triumphant. That surprised him a little. He had half expected some surge of vindication when the legal threat dissolved. What he felt instead was something quieter and more durable. The satisfaction of a man who had done the right things in the right sequence and watched them hold. The meeting with Susan Merritt happened on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the all-hands. She had called Carter's cell phone, not his work line, his personal number, and asked if he had time for an off-the-record conversation. He said yes, and they met at a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue, the same one where he had first talked to Brooke about building something new. Susan was a careful woman, a professional liability assessor by temperament, if not by title, and she spoke with the precision of someone who had spent years knowing that words had consequences. She was not there to recruit him. She was not there to represent the firm. She was, in her own framing, simply closing the loop on some things she needed to understand. What she told him over the course of an hour was this. The partners of Hargrove and Lind, the 3 senior partners who had founded the firm 20 years ago and whose names were on the letterhead, had begun a formal internal review of Derek Holloway's tenure as senior managing director. The review had been triggered not by Carter's departure specifically, but by the pattern it had made visible. The commission restructuring, the client assignment protocols, the staff attrition. The revenue loss, taken individually, each was defensible. Taken together, they told a story that the founding partners were not comfortable with. "I can't tell you what the outcome of the review will be," Susan said. "I shouldn't even be telling you this much. But I wanted you to know that what happened, the way it happened, did not go unexamined." Carter looked at her across the table. "Why are you telling me?" Susan wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Because I was the one who signed off on Derek's onboarding package," she said, "and I was the one who received your documented complaints and routed them through proper channels and watched them disappear. I could have escalated. I didn't." She paused. "I think I owed you at least this much." Carter said nothing for a moment. "I don't need it," he said finally, "but I appreciate it." He meant both things. He walked back to the office on Erie Street in the cold December air, hands in his coat pockets, watching the city move around him. The lunch crowds thinning, the delivery bikes weaving between cabs, the distant grey shimmer of the lake at the end of every east-west street. He thought about Derek Holloway standing at the front of that all-hands meeting, speaking the language of recalibration to a room full of people who knew exactly what had happened. He thought about the laugh, not with anger, more with the clarity of someone who has passed through a thing and come out on the other side of it and can now see its actual dimensions. Derek had laughed because he had genuinely believed that Carter Blake was not a threat, that the relationships Carter had built over 6 years were assets of the institution and not products of the person. It was the central miscalculation of a man who had spent his career managing systems and had never understood that the most durable thing in any business is not the contract or the brand or the commission structure. It is the trust between 2 people who have chosen to work together. Derek had managed the system. Carter had managed the trust. And when Carter walked out the door, the trust walked with him, 14 times over. He took the elevator up to the 4th floor on Erie Street. hung his coat on the hook by the door, and sat down at his desk. Brooke was on a call in the glass conference room, her posture straight and her notebook open, gesturing with her pen the way she did when she was making a point she needed the other person to feel. Nathan was across the room, headset on, laughing at something a contact had said. The easy, genuine laugh of a man who was good at his job and knew it. The whiteboard on the far wall now had a new set of numbers on it. A pipeline that had grown beyond the original 14. New conversations. New possibilities. Carter opened his laptop and got back to work. The first quarterly review of Blake and Callahan Partners took place on a Friday morning in late January in the glass conference room on Erie Street, with 8 people around a table that had been too large for the room when they bought it and now felt appropriately sized. Carter had ordered breakfast from the diner around the corner, the good kind, not the corporate kind, with actual coffee in a carafe and pastries from the Polish bakery on Chicago Avenue that Brooke had discovered on a lunch walk in December. Small things. But he had learned, in the years of watching Derek Holloway confuse performance with substance, that the small things were very often the real things. The numbers were not spectacular by the standards of a firm 10 years established. But for a company that had existed for 11 weeks, they were, in the word that James Whitfield used when Carter walked him through the presentation the previous afternoon, serious. 12 active clients, $3 million in annual contract value under management, a business development pipeline with 6 qualified prospects and 2 proposals pending, an operating cost structure lean enough to project break-even at 14 months, ahead of the 18-month target they had set at the outset. A staff of 4, Carter, Brooke, Nathan, and a junior account coordinator named Emily Schultz, who had joined 2 weeks prior fresh out of DePaul's business school and had already demonstrated the particular quality Carter had learned to value above almost everything else. She asked good questions. He presented the numbers without theater. When he was done, he looked around the table at the people who had built this thing with him. Brooke, who had left a stable position on a handshake and a shared set of values. Nathan, who had put his own resignation letter on Susan Merritt's desk on the same morning Carter had put his on Derek's desk. Emily, who had joined knowing full well she was taking a risk on a company that was 11 days old at the time of her interview. "We're not here because we were the loudest or the most aggressive," Carter said. "We're here because we were honest with the people who trusted us, and we kept being honest when it would have been easier not to be. That's the only thing I want us to protect as we grow, not the revenue number, not the client count, the reason those numbers exist." Nobody said anything immediately after that, the kind of silence that follows a true thing. Then James Whitfield, who had come in person for the review, as he did for almost all of his business meetings, because he had never trusted a relationship that only existed over a screen, leaned back in his chair and said, "You should have left 18 months ago." The room laughed, Carter included. "You're probably right," Carter said. "I am definitely right," James said. "But here we are. Here they were." The weeks that followed the quarterly review had the specific texture of a business finding its rhythm, the beginning of predictability, the early signs that a system was becoming reliable, clients renewed, proposals converted. Emily turned out to have an instinct for client communication that was, in Brooke's assessment, almost annoying because she makes it look effortless, and I've been working at this for 5 years. The news about Derek Holloway came through Nathan, who had maintained one close friendship at Hargrove and Lind with a senior account manager named Greg Paulson. According to Greg, and this was confirmed 2 days later by a brief and carefully worded item in a Chicago business publication, Derek Holloway had been removed from his position as senior managing director in mid-January following the completion of an internal review. The firm had announced a leadership restructuring and the appointment of an interim director while a search for a permanent replacement was conducted. No further details were made public. Carter did not seek them out. He read the item once, set his phone face down on his desk, and continued working. He did not feel vindicated in the way he might once have imagined he would. There was no surge of satisfaction, no desire to mark the moment, or share it, or reference it in any way. What he felt was something more like the relief of a man who has been carrying a weight he did not fully realize he was carrying. Not the weight of a grudge or a wound exactly, but the ambient weight of an unresolved injustice, and has watched it simply resolve on its own by the operation of cause and effect. Derek had built something on noise and performance and the appropriation of other people's work. What he had built had, in the end, held exactly as long as the appearance of solidity could be maintained, and no longer. Carter had built something on honesty and trust and the patient accumulation of real relationships. It was smaller. It was newer. It was, in every measurable way, more fragile than what Derek had commanded. But it was real, and it was his, and it was growing. He thought about the morning he had walked into Derek's office with the envelope in his jacket pocket. The 4 seconds of silence, the laugh, the easy confidence of a man who was not worried. He thought about what Derek had not understood, what arrogance at its core always fails to understand. That the people you dismiss on your way up are not gone. They simply go somewhere else, and they take with them everything they actually built, and they build it again, somewhere you can no longer reach it. On the last Friday of January, Carter left the office at 6 o'clock. Not late for a founder of a young company, but earlier than his habit, and deliberate in that. Brooke had instituted a policy, informal but firm, that Fridays ended at 6 for the first year, because they were all going to need the reserves that rest provides, and because the culture of a company is set in its first year by what its leaders actually do, not what they say. Carter walked out onto Erie Street into the last of the afternoon light. January in Chicago, which meant grey and cold, and the particular kind of beautiful that only people who love the city understand. He walked east toward the lake, because he often did when he needed to think, and because the lake always told the truth about the scale of things. He stood at the railing above the lakefront path and looked out at the grey water and the pale sky and the distant smudge of the Indiana shoreline, and he thought, not for the first time, but for the first time with something like peace, about the last year of his life, the 6 years before it. The decision that had looked, to Derek Holloway, like a man walking into nothing. He had not been walking into nothing. He had been walking into everything he had actually built, every real conversation, every kept promise, every moment of honest work that had nothing to do with the institution that had housed it, and everything to do with the person who had done it. The wind off the lake was cold and direct and entirely honest, the way Chicago always was. He turned up his collar and started walking back. There was work to do, good work, work that was his, and he was not by any measure finished.